silent? Does it feel a little bit awkward? Does it feel a little bit uncomfortable? Does it feel a little bit strange? And yet silence is how we can focus. Silence is how we can give our brains some time to process what's going around. There isn't enough silence in our organizations today. So if you want to bring one thing back into the office after this talk, let that be a little bit of silence. But I want to introduce silence to you today also because my talk is not really going to be a lecture. I'm not going to teach you anything here today. I want to take you on a journey. And actually, it's going to be my own journey. But I hope that that journey will be useful and interesting for you as well. My name is Marcin Floryan, and today I work as an engineering operations lead at Spotify. Don't ask me what that job title means. I don't know. I made it up a year ago. Nobody else in my organization knows that either. But it doesn't stop me from doing some good stuff. So where do we start today? We're going to try and go through some reflections together. And I would like to offer you 5 reflections. Reflections on predictions. Reflections on being busy. We like that, right? Cliff talked about the multiple things that constantly demand our attention. Gitta talked about being professional. Or not. We're going to talk about that too. But even more importantly, Gitta told us about being nice. Well, let's see where being nice gets us. And we're going to finish by talking about fear. Hopefully not triggering too much fear for everyone here. I'm taking you on this journey as it has really reflected my own growth as a leader. And even though today I'm in a formal leadership position, I hope that everyone here, engineers, product owners, designers, agile coaches, scrum masters, managers, we all can feel a little bit like leaders in our organizations. Because that's the only way that we can influence what's going on. Because all of our voices are important in the work that we do. I also want to tell you that I've spent my last 7 years working in Sweden. That's been a fantastic experience. And the previous 10 years I've spent working in the UK. And that has exposed me to a number of different organizations. Some of them were great. Some of them, not so much. So this is where these reflections come from. Do you know what this is? Looks like an assembly line, right? What company? Yes, of course, this is Ford. Why am I showing you the picture of the Ford assembly line? Well, it was the first assembly line, mass production, indeed. Cliff mentioned that yesterday as well. This idea of the organization as a machine, this is where it comes from. This is where scientific management comes from. And it turns out that that playbook, that is still so common and used everywhere, is out of date. Who would have thought that? The Industrial Revolution is no more. And yet we're so often stuck in the ways that it suggested. How many of you have heard this term already? Right, very good. I see hands going up, but not all the hands. So let me explain this. We talk a lot about the world today being a VUCA world. A world full of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And actually, the timing of this talk is perfect, because we have just all, around the entire globe, experienced exactly this. Volatility, uncertainty, complexity. How do we deal with the pandemic? How do we deal with people working from home? How do we deal with kids running around and trying to have a meeting at the same time? That's what happened, right? And when I was preparing for this talk and putting these slides together, I thought, maybe I'm going to show you the graph of the pandemic with the first wave that everyone thought was the worst. And then the second wave, doubling it. And then the third wave that was even higher. But you know what? Something else happened after that. A war in Ukraine. And that shattered all of that. I'm not going to be showing you pictures from the war. I'm sure you've had enough. But it turns out that this idea of the VUCA world doesn't quite capture what we're feeling. And also the explanation that it's all because of scientific management and Ford, well, it turns out it's not quite like this. So even though we know that there's a bunch of important ways in which we can try to thrive in this VUCA world, by doing discovery, by increasing our optionality, by building a community, by collaborating, that you've just beautifully experienced on this stage, and by having resilience, which all really amounts to building a learning organization, it turns out that today, this might not be enough. Anyone heard of this company? All right, I see some hands going up. If you haven't heard the story of Theranos, I really, really recommend, if listening is your thing, to listen to the Dropout podcast. And if you'd rather watch it, watch the Dropout series. I think it's on Disney Plus and it's on Hulu. So for those of you who haven't come across this story, Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes, whose picture you can see behind me, had this amazing idea. From a single drop of blood, we're going to run all of your tests. You're going to get all the results of any blood test possible from a single blood drop. Who wouldn't want that? Would you want that? Would you want that? Yes! And it turned out that most of the America wanted that too. They wanted it so much that Elizabeth Holmes, after dropping out from Stanford, was able to convince dozens and dozens of investors to pump millions and millions of dollars into her company to make that reality come true. Former presidents supported this idea. She had the chief of staff of the president on her board. She had the military behind her. And yet, you know what? It was all a fraud. The device was never built, and the dream was never realized. And it was not for the lack of trying, and it was not for the lack of ambition. Maybe it's just not physically possible, even though the dream was so amazing. But what has happened along the journey is that Elizabeth has built a company that has destroyed the employees that were working there. They were working so hard trying to deliver on that amazing vision that they burned out, that they left. At least one person committed suicide as a result of working at her company. Fortunately, 10 years after this great idea was published, she was taken to court and found guilty of fraud. And that just happened this year. I don't know exactly what the sentence was. But I'm telling you this story to tell you that things go wrong not just because we have forgotten that the scientific management and the old principles from the industrial revolutions don't work, but also if we're too focused on the idea and not focused on the organization and how it works. So for those of you who know about VUCA world, I wonder if you know about the BANI world. By the way, it works really well in Polish, right? So it turns out that the way to think about our world today is that it is not just volatile, uncertain, ambiguous, and complex, but that it is brittle, full of anxiety, non-linear, and incomprehensible. It is brittle, as we have seen recently. I mean, do you want to check the oil prices? And I don't mean the oil that we use to run our cars, that we should have stopped years ago. But I mean the cooking oil. Or the price of wheat. That's the brittleness of the systems that we've built. So we really have to go back to the work of people like Donella Meadows that Cliff talked about yesterday to really understand the system and create resilience. That anxiety, who have experienced that in the last 2 years? Almost everyone. Who has experienced way too much of it? Absolutely. Felt totally overwhelmed. And this idea of non-linearity, that things don't really connect, that we can't just say, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Because the connection between cause and effect is broken in today's world. And it has been for a long time because the world is complex. And we have to keep that in mind. And finally, this idea of the world being incomprehensible. We are so overwhelmed with data and information. Which of that information is actually true? But the good news is that we can actually start to make some sense and create some meaning. So what do we need in the BANI world, on top of the learning that we needed in the VUCA world? We need empathy, and we need support. So this is really what this talk is about. I promised 5 reflections. So let's start with predictions. Who likes predictions? Some people like predictions. So you've been playing some bingo just a moment ago. So let's try it again, actually. I have a question for you. What do predictions look like? Just think about this for a moment. Write a list of few things that signify predictions in your organizations. Right? I have some suggestions, but I'll let you think for a moment. What do predictions look like? Okay, and you can shout out bingo if you thought about one of the things that I'm about to show. Budgets. Yes, very good. Absolutely. Budgets are a beautiful idea for creating predictions. We have no idea how much money we spend. No idea at all how much things will cost. And yet, at the start of the financial year, we're supposed to tell our finance department exactly how much money we're going to spend. Right? Brilliant. It's like Bjarte Boxnes from Beyond Budgeting says, it's as if the bank was open only one day a year. Who would use that bank? Okay. What else do predictions look like? Fixed plans. Yay, very good. We have some fixed planners. And we know, of course, that no plan survives the interaction with reality, which doesn't mean to say that we should stop planning, because the activity of planning is very useful, can be very useful. But getting stuck in following a plan blindly is usually as good as this crystal ball. Bingo. Yes, someone said bingo for estimates. Estimates are predictions. I'm going to show you later how good they are. If you're doing estimates, please stop. We can do another talk about this. Yay! Someone thought that strategies were also wishful thinking. Yes. And again, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a strategy. But a 5-year strategy that is fixed in scope and never changes and never evolves rarely helps. Oh, fantastic. I think it was Ron Jeffries that recently tweeted that if there was one thing that he's really sorry about when it comes to Scrum was thinking about story points and team velocities. Honestly. I mean, again, it's not helpful because mostly it gets us to try to predict the future and try to make decisions on those predictions that don't always work. So what do we do if we can't do predictions? And this is a great summary of what we just said from Amy and Whitson. That traditional models emphasize those plans, details, roles, budgets, schedules. These are all tools of certainty and predictability, which we already know doesn't exist. We experienced it firsthand. So I just want to give you one small example. I mean, you'll have to figure this out yourself. I'm sorry. That's what this talk is about, your own journey. But one of the teams that I worked with, not directly, it was one of the teams in my organization, did this. So this was, they just literally captured for every single piece of work they did, when did it start, when did it end? And they had the idea of a cycle time. And instead of story points and predictions, they used past data to do Monte Carlo simulations, to be able to answer the questions, when will you be done? How long will it take? Based on real data. So this is a little picture presentation from Marcus Hamrin, one of my colleagues. And he was trying to answer, how many items can we complete in a given amount of time? And then that gave them the idea of how much they should plan for a quarter. And then you can do something like this, which is, when we'll be done with our 20 items in that case? And said, well, it depends. How certain do you want to be about that date? If you're okay with 50% certainty, that's okay, head for the middle. If you really want to hit that date with 95% confidence level, well, then it has to be 2 months later. Yes, yeah, oh, yes, good. True, years later, exactly, 2 years later. So that's quite a span. But that's really about our appetite for risk. So recently, we ran the same thing at a larger scale in my organization. This involves about 700 engineers. And let's not get into the details. I just pulled a slide from a presentation. Ignore the KDs. Let's just assume that these, I'm trying to explain, if you don't understand, that the white bar was the idea of how much the teams thought they could do, right? And then this small bar right next to it is how much they actually got done. So we had data from the fourth quarter. So what did we do in my team? We ran a forecast. And then we compared that with the data. So the white bar is how much the teams estimated the work that they could do. Turns out, our forecast was so much closer to what actually happened. So hopefully, you're done with story points now. And the reason I really do not like predictions is because predictions are expected to be right. And I want to offer another word, forecasts. Because forecasts are often wrong. Paul told me that I should go out to Krakow yesterday because today there were some convection storms in the forecast. I might take my chances and wander out again. And maybe I avoid getting wet, or maybe I take the risk of being wet, or maybe I get an umbrella. But there is a very important thing about predictions, is that in so many of our organizations, who are the people who are most responsible for these predictions? It's the leaders, and it's usually the senior leaders, especially when we talk about budgets and plans and strategies. And when we ask our leaders to make predictions, we stop them from being able to not be right. By asking them to make predictions, we put them into the corner of having to be right. But leaders don't have to be right. In fact, the best leaders aren't. Not all the time, at least. So, in this first reflection, I would like to invite you to go from predictions to forecasts instead, and allow yourself to be wrong. So, how about being busy? Another time for bingo. What does being busy look like? Think for a moment. What does being busy look like? I'm going to take this opportunity to have a bit of water. Yay, bingo! Who loves meetings? Not me. Some people love meetings. Meetings is number one reason we are busy in the organizations. Interruptions? Yay, some bingo's going on. Fantastic. You're getting good at this game. You might win at the end. Who knows? Oh my goodness. I mean, that's such a plague. High whip. High levels of work in progress that is keeping us endlessly running in circles, trying to do 10 things at a time, when in fact the only effective way of working on is maybe one or two. Delays. Great. Someone experienced delays. Nobody else here? Nah, don't believe you. But there's another thing which comes to leadership, is open door policy. That's also all about being busy. So let's reflect on this. Like, what does the current literature tell us about being busy? Well, it turns out it's amazing. That's what the leaders do, right? An average work week of 73.5 hours. Just a little reminder, in the EU, we think 40 is okay. And if you want to be productive, I think actually was a presentation yesterday, or maybe today, or maybe there was an open space session about 4 days a week work. And so you can contrast that with something that Daniel said, and actually I should have pulled the quote because it was in an interview. And he says, I typically don't have more than really 3 or 4 meetings per day. And he says that he does this because that creates time for his team to go to him and have conversations. And we've talked about this complex world. If we're constantly busy, we are focused on our work. And it becomes so hard to work with others. Because the developer next door asking for a review, support, reflection is just a distraction that gets us even more busy. Fortunately, there are organizations, and hopefully many of you are, practicing pair programming or even ensemble programming where the whole team comes together. And what many leaders think about that? What a waste of resources. Right? That's what we hear. And yet it turns out that it allows us to have focus. So this is why it is so important to not be constantly busy, but to bring those different perspectives. But in order to be able to benefit from it, you can't just stop being busy. You also have to listen. Gitte might have mentioned that yesterday too. But we can't listen unless we're silent. So in the second reflection, I invite you to go from being busy to being present with the people around you. And you know what? I'll tell you a funny story. Open door policy, you like that, right? I heard from someone in a large company that managers were inaccessible. The survey said that people don't get time to spend with their managers. So, of course, what does HR do? They institute the open door policy. And what did it look like? I mean, the managers were still in their private offices, and they were supposed to have a little page or like display on their door saying open door policy. So of course that didn't work. So HR thought like, nah, we have to work harder here. And they invested in these really fancy door stoppers, which kept the manager's doors physically open. So you know what managers did? Pulled them out when they had meetings, and then nobody was coming in. HR was really upset. Pissed off, you could say. You know what they did next? They went to talk to facilities. They removed the doors. True story. Do you think people were coming into these offices anymore? Nope. Because these managers weren't present there for their people. Being professional, my favorite. I was told this so many times. You need to be really professional when you work here. So let's play another round of bingo. It's going to be a few more. What does being professional look like? Gitte, what does being professional look like? Are you thinking? All right, that's my hint for another sip of water. Yay, bingo, dress code. So I'm a little proud to say that since moving from the UK to Sweden, I am yet to open my box of ties. And I realized I collected way too many. Bingo, strict roles, right? It's so unprofessional with all these fluffy roles. We don't know who's responsible for what. So let's make sure they're well defined. Yay, bingo, right? I mean, come on. How unprofessional is it to laugh in a meeting? Cry in a meeting, heaven forbid? Honestly. I mean, I remember talking to some fellow managers in one of the company, and And we were going like, we're fairly new into this management game, so we're sharing worst stories. What was the worst thing that can happen to a manager? Well, someone crying in their meeting. How can you handle such unprofessional behavior? Anyone else has clean desk policy? Because messy desks, they're so unprofessional. I mean, a picture of your pet, your kids, your partner, totally unprofessional. Turns out, questioning decisions, also very unprofessional. I was told that quite a few times. And it turns out that operating this way, conforming to hierarchical roles, emotional distance, is lonely and unfulfilling. That's where being professional gets us. It doesn't get us to great results. But why are we talking about being professional and being busy? Because we started with a prediction. And we have this belief that to get the plan done, we had to start getting busy and acting professionally. And it gets better. But this is where being professional ends up. So I am so grateful to the pandemic in a way, because it has shown so many of us that actually working without the manager's watchful eye can work. I mean, we don't stop doing our work. In fact, maybe we do a little bit too much of it. But it also opened us to each other's personal lives. You start to see that dog or that kid or that messy bedroom. You start hearing that there's actually dishwasher that just finished, or that there is someone at the door with a parcel. And then we can invite more of ourselves into work. And Brené Brown tells us that in order for us to really own our performance, to really be the best, we need to create authentic relationships with the colleagues, with the others. That's how we're getting to be really professional. So, I'm inviting you to move from being professional to being authentic, to be who you really are. Just like Paul at the start of this conference shared with us one aspect of who he truly is. So what comes with being professional? Of course, an important aspect of being professional is being nice, right? Okay, what does being nice look like? You know the drill by now, and I'm getting my sip of water. Keeping hydrated. Does being nice means using careful language? Yay, bingo. Does being nice mean avoiding conflict? Oh my goodness, the stories I could tell you. Swedes excel at conflict avoidance. They would go to such lengths. What happens if your neighbor puts up a tree that you don't like? Huh? What do you do in Sweden? Yes, you move out. Of course, you buy another house. On a true story. What else? No clear expectations. Thank you for the bingo there. Gitta knows something about this. She tried to convince me to get better at it at some point in the past. And I'm very grateful, because not setting clear expectations and boundaries may be nice, but it's not what works. Turns out being nice on the surface also leads to office politics. Because we can't say some of the things we want to say, we don't want to have conflicts, but we still have these things, desires, ideas that we want to get through. So how do we get them through? We talk to others behind closed doors in the corridors, secretly. And my favorite, being nice, feedback sandwich. Tell them how they're good, tell them how they're shit, but end on the high note. Seriously, never works. Never works. Please don't do this. And if you want to know what to do instead, find me after this. And here again, an amazing suggestion from Brené Brown. And she was talking here about giving feedback. First, name the issue. It's a tough conversation, but clear is kind. Sometimes, in order to have a good conversation, we have to be uncomfortable and say things that we don't quite know how to say. But this is getting us into being kind. Why is there a lion here? Because it turns out that having those tough conversations, leaning into conflict, requires courage. A very important feature for managers and leaders and everyone in the organization, to have the courage to stand up for what we believe, to call out what is wrong. But that courage doesn't exist in a vacuum. We have to create an environment where it's possible. And now you know a little bit about creating that environment of psychological safety where courage is possible from Gitta's talk yesterday. So I want to invite you in this reflection to think about how can you go from being a nice person that everybody likes. I mean, who doesn't like to be liked? I love it. I mean, it drove my career for a few years. Felt so good until it no longer did. To being kind to the people that you're working with, which means sometimes offering some criticism, which means sometimes saying what you really truly believe in, sometimes disagreeing with others, sometimes leaning into conflict. It's worth it. So what happens if we made those predictions and then we got busy and we're being very professional and very nice to each other, but things go to shit anyway, and dates are slipping, the budgets are dwindling, and we promised all these things to the market, like Elizabeth did? Well, we think that there's only one tool left in our toolbox, which is to lead with fear. I mean, if people are afraid, they will surely do what we tell them to do, right? What does fear in an organization look like? I mean, I'm hoping you're really making this up, right? Never experienced it. So what did you make up? Did you make up individual accountability? Bingo, thank you very much. Yeah. Why wouldn't we have one person accountable for delivery? Because then they can be afraid that they might get fired and they're going to work really hard and get everyone else to work, right? Turns out, actually, some of the best American football teams don't have a captain. Because when you no longer have one person accountable for winning the match, suddenly everyone wants to work together to win the match. Performance management, bingo. I mean, come on. If I'm constantly afraid that I'm going to be rated as a 1 on a scale of 1 to 5, and that I know that the 10% of bottom ones get fired, I'm going to work so much harder, right? So much better. I was giving a talk recently at a small event, Beyond Budgeting Roundtable, with lots of people from big corporations, mostly finance people, but there was one HR person. And I shared a little bit with that group about the principles and practices that we employ at my company. And that HR person came to me afterwards and had some questions. And that was her first question. How do you do performance management at Spotify? And I was like, I don't know how to answer this question. Well, of course we don't. But that is not a satisfying answer to that question. But that was the first answer. Performance management just gets people to try to chase their own goals. Anyone found this? Fear? Bingo? Yes. If we're afraid we can't speak up, we're not going to share what we think. We're going to gossip. Secrets? I mean, come on, what's the best way to keep all the employees on the edge is to keep them guessing if the new round of redundancies is coming or not. If you're not quite sure whether the business is doing well or not. Super effective. And fear so often leads to isolation. Turns out we knew this all along. 1756 is when this quote is from. No passion so effectively robs the mind of all its powers, of acting and reasoning, as fear. And then a more modern reflection. Fear of supervision sanction, loss of material reward, performance management. Managers were able to coerce and intimidate workers to ensure high productivity. Sure, if that worker's job was to dig a trench, to put a bonnet on the car, to tighten a few screws, maybe that have worked. People weren't too happy, but sure, we got some productivity. It doesn't work. In volatile, uncertain environments with a lot of anxiety and nonlinear effects. But there's another way. And here's a really nice quote from Saiichi Toyoda. He's the founder of Toyota Corporation, where already in the beginning, like late 19th century, he was encouraging his organization to always strive to build a home-like atmosphere at work that is warm and friendly. There's a contention idea here. Should we have friends at work? I've talked to many people in the past, and some people go like, no, I'm not going to work to make friends. I'm going to work to do my job. I'm going to go home and make friends there. But it turns out that creating this artificial boundary between your work life and your personal life doesn't work. If the stuff that happens at work influences what happens at home, And the stuff that happens at home influences what happens at work. And anyway, we're spending way too much time at work to not spend it with people that we care about, that we feel good with, that we enjoy the company of. So, if not fear, what else? Here's a psychiatrist researcher who suggests that there are only two emotions: love and fear. And that all positive emotions come from love, and all negative emotions come from fear. Would you rather have anger, hate, anxiety, and guilt? Or would you want to experience happiness, contentment, peace, and joy? If fear helps us survive, again, remember Cliff saying that it was super useful in the plains of Africa thousands of years ago. We need love to thrive. I'm expecting you all to get a little bit outraged by now. Because here's this crazy guy standing in front of you, telling you to love the people you work with. I mean, this is an uncomfortable word, even at home, with our kids and partners, let alone at work. And yet, I'm inviting you all today to go from leading with fear to leading with love. There you go. My 5 reflections. Go from forecasts to predictions. From being busy to being present with your people. From being professional to being your authentic self. From being nice to everyone to being truly kind. And to lead with love over leading with fear. It's time to change the world by changing yourselves.